On today's show, an NBA free agency preview because we're getting very close to what transpires there across the league. We'll touch on what the Hawks could possibly do in the coming days with a rundown of who is available on the market. Obviously, more of a trade market than a free agent market right now for the Hawks, but still a lot to get into. We'll have all of that, the latest rumors, and more coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1271 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Tuesday evening into Wednesday. In fact, this time of year, I have to tell you what time I'm recording this podcast. It's about 8:35 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday, January 28th, and we are less than 48 hours from the opening of free agency. So most of the podcast today will be me writing down some options for the Hawks that are really just kind of available, trying to touch on all of the available options within reason for Atlanta on the free agent market in particular. We'll give you some context as well as that, because obviously some of the trade stuff is more high profile at this point in time. There's all kinds of rumors floating out there. In fact, this is my fourth show of the week already. On two of the first three episodes, I talked at least a little bit about Dejounte Murray and all the rumors there. A little bit of an update here at the top of the podcast. I did a full roundup on Monday, but the only thing that was kind of new on Tuesday was that Jake Fisher of Bleacher Report was on Nate Duncan's podcast. I mentioned that he actually heard that John Collins could be back in the mix as part of a Spurs trade possibility, with maybe involving a third team, etc. And, a lot of the attention has been sort of pivoted to the Gallinari hypothetical that we discussed a little bit on Monday. The door is still open for that as well, from what I understand, but they have to raise the guaranteed money for Gallo by Wednesday to make some sort of deal with a Gallinari for Murray kind of swap. So all kinds of indications there, but certainly at this point in time, nothing seems to be imminent. Of course, that could change in the next few minutes, even while I'm recording this podcast or right after I record this podcast. I'm well aware of that at this point, but no one has reported that it's close. No one's reported that it's almost there. And it seemed like, at least from Jake's reporting, that it's kind of been a little bit sort of on again, off again. And also, as a reminder, I'm not sure if you have to sort of hear this, but the Hawks are not the only suitor for Dejounte Murray. I know that's been the more widely discussed option for the Spurs at this point in time. But with some of the reporting that I've heard from behind the scenes or even in front of the scenes is that there are other teams calling as well, and they don't have to trade him right now either. Obviously, the Spurs could pivot in that direction, but I kind of doubt that it's only a one-team race for Murray's services at this point in time. So interesting stuff along the way, and we'll have all kinds of focus on that when we need to in the coming hours and days. From there, I want to get into most of this podcast about the free agent landscape and a couple of sort of housekeeping notes here at the top. One of those things is not necessarily a free agent pursuit, but it's sort of in line with free agency. And that's a reminder and also sort of an overview at this point in time that DeAndre Hunter becomes extension eligible as soon as free agency opens. Basically, that's sort of the, again, that's a Thursday, 6 p.m. Eastern time deadline. It used to be July 1st. Now it's June 30th, the evening of. But, the extension talks can't start until then, technically. I'm sure they've been talking behind the scenes. And as a spoiler alert, tampering is not necessarily cracked down on in the NBA world. You've seen a lot of that stuff right now. In fact, like Jalen Brunson has basically already swung back and forth a few times, tampering. I will just say that don't put your head in the sand. A lot of the stuff's already getting done, but officially you cannot make deals in free agency or make extension talks or negotiations or signings until the league year change is over. And Hunter is obviously their extension candidate this year. Obviously, in years past, the Hawks have had some sort of off and on success with extensions. John Collins did not sign one, famously. Trae Young signed one last year that was sort of a no-brainer, one that everyone kind of knew was going to get done for the absolute max. And then Kevin Huerter took a little while, but that actually got done as well. They don't have to hurry. Anything with Hunter can be signed between basically when free agency opens on Thursday until mid-October. So they have, 3.5 months or so if they want to negotiate that out. Usually these deals get done either quickly in July or they get done near the extension deadline. That's not, of course, a rule that's written in stone. They could make it an extension deal with Hunter in August. I just think that, usually going by history, it's going to be pretty quickly, you would imagine. Also, or it'll be probably a little bit later in the process. But my stance, as always, if you're a new listener, just to sort of run that down, would be, generally speaking, unless you are an absolute no-brainer max player, i.e. Trae Young, on the team side, I think the team should be cautious with extensions. I think that basically you have to remember that you're taking on all the risk as if you are the team getting an extension out a year in advance. And in order to sort of make that trade-off, you need to be getting a pretty good deal to lock that player in with some upside in the future. Just for example, I thought the Kevin Huerter deal last year was a good deal for the Hawks. It was not an A-plus deal for the Hawks, but I think that Huerter signed for cheap enough where it made some sense for the Hawks to do it. If Hunter is going to ask for $20+ million a year, I personally would not do that as the Hawks right now because I don't think he's proven enough at this point to actually command that. But if you're Hunter's side, you obviously want to ask for the moon and sort of demand that, because honestly, if Hunter has a breakout season in year 4, which is not a given, but it certainly could happen, he could be demanding $100 million next summer because of the position that he plays, the skill set that he potentially presents at 6'8" as a sort of a two-way forward. There's a lot of upside there, and the Hawks probably know that as well. So it will not. But also, as a salary cap note, it will not impact this year's salary cap no matter what. Famously, last year Trey signed the extension, but his deal does not kick in until this coming season. And then, of course, that got bumped up with the Supermax as well because he made All-NBA. But there was some reporting out there that the Hawks want to get it done with Hunter. I'm sure they want to if they can. I will be interested to see if they can find a middle ground between where I think the Hawks might be trying to land in a more bargain range versus where Hunter is looking. But a very interesting negotiation for a former top 5 pick. He has a pretty high cap hold and also had that one flash 2 years ago where he was awesome for about a month. But other than that, it's been a little bit of a mixed bag. And famously, I was pretty low on the way that Hunter actually played on the floor in his 3rd season. But still, I think that there is a lot of untapped potential there. And if he can stay healthy and put it all together, he could be a sort of a near max kind of guy with the way the market is looking, because that's just kind of what those guys cost. Mikal Bridges, et cetera, a pretty recent example. So I wanted to at least say that out loud. That is the non-free agency thing to watch in the coming days and hours, but certainly something to keep an eye on because Hunter could upstage everything else. Clearly not quite as sexy of a notion because he's already on the team as stuff like Dejounte Murray, but Hunter, that's a pretty big deal in terms of stuff to keep an eye out for in the next week or so. Okay, before we get into some other topics, I will just run down quickly some of the big swings. In fact, one of the ones I'm going to go to right now is sort of the one that we've already talked about a lot on the show, so I'm going to kind of keep this a little bit short. Deandre Ayton is a guy the Hawks can go out and get in a sign and trade, but they do not have the capital to sign him in free agency. We're going to go through the entire salary cap stuff in a second, but basically, the simple version is that the Hawks do not have cap space. The Hawks have some exceptions, but anybody that's going to be making more than the mid-level exception, the Hawks cannot just sign outright in their current position. So Ayton has to be a trade, and it's obviously pretty straight ahead in some respects, but there's some salary matching stuff that I'm not going to go all the way into. Talked about Ayton quite a bit in the last couple of weeks and months, but a former number one overall pick, obviously he'll be 24 years old pretty soon. All signs point to him being very available from the Suns. He'd be a very interesting fit with the Hawks. Clearly, the Hawks have some pretty strong center play already with Capella and Okongwu, but Ayton is already a good player on both ends of the floor. He's a little bit frustrating on offense at times. Defensively, still pretty good, if not I would say totally dominant defensively. He's just pretty good, not bad, but good. I think he's a possibility for sure, and there's a lot of room to grow there. He's obviously a very, very talented player in a lot of different ways. I think Chris Kirschner reported recently that the Hawks will not be necessarily interested in offering the full max to Ayton, and honestly, I think that paying the full max for DeAndre Ayton and, I want to say crucially, and including good players and or draft picks and a sign and trade to get him is not great value. Does it mean you shouldn't do it? No, that's not necessarily. I think that Ayton is someone who has the upside where it does make some sense to pursue him. But the combination of a full max plus assets is probably an overpay in a vacuum for DeAndre Ayton. But still, a bet on Ayton is more of a bet for the future in a lot of ways because, yes, he's good. He's already good right now. Don't get me wrong. But right now, he's not an absolute dominant, number one kind of player. He's more like a top 40-ish guy in the league, something like that. Whereas, like, if he makes the next leap and becomes an all-NBA kind of center, then obviously you're cooking with gas at that point in time. But the big thing is that he'd be signed long-term, and he's so young. 23 years old, be 24 years old soon, but you're getting his entire prime if you go ahead and pull that kind of deal off, and that would be a huge X factor in a potential pursuit of DeAndre Ayton. But clearly he's the number one guy in terms of, like, visibility and guy that's been talked about as a free agent target, again, via sign and trade for the Hawks. I wanted to sort of start with him, and we'll come back to other guys in a moment. Before we get to all of that, though, including a big name that I've not heard really anything about that's at least a possibility maybe in the future, a word from our sponsors on today's podcast. Today's show is brought to you by Rock Auto. And the auto world has been mixing models these days. It's actually impossible for local chain stores to stock all the car and truck parts that you actually need for your automobile. But even if they had them, you actually want to endure all the people behind the counter. They want to say what they want to sell you. It's in their best interest to have a commission or whatever's in their warehouse, etc. Instead, do what's best for you, the actual consumer. And the best thing to do if you're the consumer is check out rockauto.com at home or in your pocket. It's a much better option overall. Why spend more for the exact same auto parts from a chain store or dealership when you order them online at rockauto.com? It's a family business. They've served customers for more than 20 years at this point, and Rock Auto's prices are reliably low for each and every customer. And they have absolutely everything you possibly want for your car or your truck. That includes brake parts and motor oil, tail lamps, even carpet. Check out the website right now at rockauto.com today. See all the parts available for your car or your truck. And when you get there, write Locked On in the box that asks you how you heard about rockauto.com so you can tell them that we sent you their way. Amazing selection, reliable low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. All right, and before we get into the more nuts and bolts portion of the podcast with some guys who are available for less than the mid-level or for the mid-level and just kind of what the cap situation is for Atlanta with, again, less than 48 hours until free agency actually begins, I want to at least mention a guy that I've meant to mention before that really hasn't been talked about a lot for the Hawks, and with good reason. I do understand why you wouldn't talk about him. That player is Miles Bridges. Miles Bridges is kind of similar to Deandre Ayton in that he will definitely command a lot of money, and the Hawks don't have a lot of money in cap space, but there are sign and trade possibilities. And I'm honestly surprised that no one's even mentioned Bridges as a potential guy. For one, he's a clutch client, which of course Trae Young is as well. There's sort of that connection. He's a very sort of intriguing young two-way forward with a lot of upside who pair well with Trae in a lot of ways. I think part of that is that people are just going to assume he'll stay in Charlotte. And even today, on Tuesday, Mitch Kupchak, their decision maker up there with the Hornets, all but said that they're planning on keeping him. So we'll see on that. But there was some buzz out there that they don't want to necessarily pay him the max, et cetera. I think he's at least kind of a fringe guy. I am not saying this is going to be happening. In fact, I would say it's very unlikely to happen. But I think I just wanted to say out loud that Bridges has a lot of the same characteristics of DeAndre Ayton, obviously different players, but in terms of the situation. I think that you probably takes like the max or close to it in a sign and trade to get him. But the Hawks have interesting stuff they can send back. Similarly to Phoenix, where Phoenix might want Capella or Collins or whatever. The Hornets might want Capella. The Hornets might want Collins. The Hornets might want Kevin Huerter, something like that. So they have pieces to send back. They have assets to send back. And honestly, Bridges is a 24-year-old forward with defensive tools. He just averaged 20 points a game on good efficiency with 7 rebounds. He's a great athlete, et cetera. It'd be surprising to me if they actually pulled it off. But clearly, I think it's something that you at least make one call on. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but you make one call on Bridges and just see what happens. And I have not talked about that at all. People asking me kind of on the periphery a couple times in mailbag questions, but in this format, I thought it was a perfect to always address it now. Yes, I would make the call. Is it likely? Absolutely not, but it's not impossible in my mind. Okay, from there, I will just run down some numbers here for the. I know there are people that are paying attention now that don't always pay attention to the minutia of the NBA. It's definitely sort of a fan season in terms of people jumping on the bandwagon. This is the crazy time of year that's so much fun, social media wise and coverage wise, et cetera. So I'm going to just lay out some salary cap stuff for you briefly to set the stage. For one, the Hawks have a lot of money committed for next season and beyond. Trae Young is now set to make $36.6 million for next season, and as a reminder, Trae making about $6 extra million per season because of the All-NBA selection does impact the Hawks books, which we'll come back to. But Trae is at the top of the list. John Collins about $23.5 million for next year. Capella about $18.2 million. Bogdanovich for $18 million. Huerter for $14.5 million. Hunter for almost $10, about $9.8. Okongwu for $6.4. Jalen Johnson's at $2.8. And then AJ Griffin as a first-round pick with the slot that he is in will be about $3.5 million for next season. Basically, that amounts to about $138 million in guaranteed salary right now. That includes, by the way, $5 million for Gallinari, who we talked about a lot recently, but Gallo has a $5 million guarantee on his deal that could change, could be waived, could be traded, et cetera. Right now, it's $5 million guaranteed, and that puts the Hawks about $11 million or so, that's not an exact number, below the luxury tax line with only 9 players under contract. So if the Hawks were to go out and just sign minimum players for the rest of their roster, they could stay out of the tax by cutting Gallo and signing 6 minimums. That isn't a great way to build your team, and honestly, that team is worse than it was last year. So that's tough. Obviously, not what they want to do necessarily, but. And by the way, also, if they were to do the rumored Gallinari for Dejounte Murray swap, they'd already be above the tax line with 10 guys on their roster. Now, it's easier to swallow that with Murray on the roster, but I think that, as I've been saying for a while, a lot of this stuff comes down to willingness by ownership, Tony Ressler and friends, to paying the luxury tax. We do not have the answer on that. I know what he said publicly. I know what I hear privately sometimes, and that's that the Hawks don't necessarily want to pay the tax. In the league, there is some skepticism the Hawks will pay the tax this year. Maybe if they were to make a big splash, they might be more willing to do that. But we'll see is the answer at this point in time as to the Hawks' willingness to go over that tax line. Because as a reminder, going over the tax, not only do you have to pay the tax, you're not also receiving money back from teams that are actually paying the tax. And again, that's 9 players on the roster. That does not include Delon Wright, who is their backup guard, their best backup guard last year. That does not include another power forward option. Obviously, with the roster as it is right now, it's Jalen Johnson is the only thing that's behind John Collins. Depth would be a concern, obviously. And also, they can't exceed the cap to pay Delon Wright. We'll come back to that later on, but that's another sort of luxury tax kind of question. And basically, they have, if they were to shed Gallinari's money to like Oklahoma City for nothing, they would have a little bit more flexibility. But the Hawks do have either the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which is about $10-ish million in year one, or if they're over the tax line, they could pay the non-taxpayer mid-level about $6.5 million in year one. Those are the best ways for the Hawks to actually sign, not trade for, but sign a player in free agency that would help the roster. Because the only guy that they could sign for more than the minimum is Delon Wright, that's already on their roster without using an exception. So I could go way deeper on this, but basically the Hawks are already committed a ton to this roster money-wise, and they cannot just go spend. I know that not everyone wants to dive into the salary cap minutia. I totally understand that, but keep that in mind. If you see people talking about guys that they just cannot realistically sign, I have to at least try to point that out. The Hawks have to be realistic with signings. Trades are different. You can kind of do whatever you have to do in terms of you have to match salary, but signings, you only have the options that you actually have when it comes to actually signing players. So keep that all in mind as we go through this process. Okay, before we dive into a long list, by the way, of players, and I have a bunch of them to get into. In fact, I broke them down into sort of tiers, like guys who are going to be commanding the mid-level, guys who are not necessarily mid-level players, but more than the minimum, and then a bunch of minimum names at the end of the podcast, plus a little section for Delon Wright and maybe some former Hawks that I want to discuss on today's podcast. But get ready for a lot of names, a lot of people that might be at least kind of interesting coming up. But first, before I get to all that, a word from our sponsors on the show. Today's show is brought to you by BetOnline. The NBA draft is, of course, over at this point, but the madness continues in a big way with free agency on the horizon. Summer League is coming up in July, and 2023 projections are already flying around in the futures market across the basketball world. And with that in mind, BetOnline is a place to fire away on all the stuff in the futures side of things. Plus, BetOnline is the number one source for all of your betting needs and information, both in the near future and always. Find all the latest odds, news, and developments across the sports world, including major events, MLB odds and scores, latest fights, and even next season's futures on the NBA, NFL, college football, and college basketball. And even then, it's a continuous source for all the wagering avenues like live betting, esports, poker, and a ton of casino games, and much more. And they have other sports in the mix as well. That includes tennis and golf and hockey, which just concluded, but always has future stuff as well. Auto racing, rugby, lacrosse, table tennis, horse racing, soccer, cricket, and entertainment bets, as well as any sport you can possibly think of. BetOnline very likely has it. And head there right now to BetOnline on your field mobile device to learn more about all the trends and the action in the sports world. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, let's throw some names out there. This is not in any order other than just to group them together. I'm not reporting any interest on any of these guys. I might reference some interest that's already been reported from other people, but this is just me throwing out some options for the Hawks that are free agents. I'm really trying to touch on a lot of guys who are at least kind of realistic potentially in this space. This first group is the guys who are making much more than the minimum, most likely. And basically, these are guys that the Hawks can only sign without really going into tax, unless they make a big move to shed salary elsewhere. But still, sort of the headliner in this group for me is PJ Tucker, who the Hawks have already had reported interest in up in New York. It seems unlikely the Hawks will actually be able to get him, but Miami and Philly are sort of in the mix there. At 37 years old, PJ is really an awesome playoff player at this point. Obviously pretty limited regular season wise in some ways and pretty offensively not exactly the most exciting guy in the world. But Tucker is a great defender. He's what every team needs in the playoffs, that physicality, toughness. He was great against the Hawks in that series. I think it's unlikely to happen, but at least want to say that out loud. Another guy that's different but also kind of similar in terms of what it might cost is Kyle Anderson from the Grizzlies. He'll be 29 soon, and would be a very logical mid-level exception target for me if they were to move on from Collins in particular, because he can actually play both forward spots, maybe start at the 4. He's a starting caliber player, honestly. He's a very weird player. He's very slow. but he's a super long guy, really good defender, sort of on and off the ball. Perimeter shooting wise, not great, but a good passer, knows sort of how to play. And for me, he was probably the most logical guy if the Hawks had pulled off one of those like Collins for draft pick deals that they talked about at the draft, because that would have made them a lot cheaper and give them more room to go out and get someone like Kyle Anderson. But one of the big questions all the way through and any Collins deal is like, okay, what do you do now at the 4? Because Jalen Johnson, while his future is extremely bright, I think the Hawks do not want to have Jalen Johnson as their starting power forward for the beginning of next season. So they have to be sort of bridge guy there, whether it's going small or whatever. But more talent at the 4 will be needed if they move off of Collins. I think Anderson would be a very logical target there. TJ Warren on this list has only played 4 games in the last 2 seasons, and there's a chance that he's still not 100% healthy, which is why he's even on this list. Because honestly, he would have been a $20+ million a year player 2 years ago before he got hurt. That's how good he was playing. Obviously kind of a buy low flyer type if he's actually available, but a good shot creator when he's healthy, solid enough defender, and maybe obviously has a relationship with Nate McMillan from Indiana, etc. Gary Payton II is on this list. He's actually 29 years old, which is way older than you might think, but an awesome defender, like genuinely maybe the best perimeter defender in the entire league. That's how good he is on defense. Made a lot of threes this year, 36%. That's actually quite solid, but offensively, pretty limited player, but still defensively, there's a lot to like, and the Warriors, sort of benefited from him in a lot of ways during the playoff run. I don't think he's a guy that you would sign if you also signed Delon Wright, because you don't want to have necessarily 2 of those like similar size, shooting challenged, offensive challenged players. But I think Peyton in a specialist role would make a lot of sense for the Hawks. Gary Harris is on this list for me. He'll be 28 in September. Actually, probably younger than I thought he was going to be, but honestly was a pretty high end starter at the 2 for Denver at times. More of a rotational player now, but a good theoretical fit for me next to Trae Young as a good defender. The trouble being that he's kind of a small-ish 2 guard, and the Hawks already have Herter and Bogdanovich. But if they were to move on from one of those guys in some other trade, Harris finding his jump shot last year was pretty big, and he's a veteran presence, good defender, a guy that's always kind of fit well with what the Hawks wanted to do if he was available. But again, if they were to move on from Herter or Bogey, I think I'd be calling Gary Harris in a pretty quick fashion if I was Travis Schlenk. Bruce Brown, different player in a lot of ways. I've always loved him, honestly, defensively. A pretty cool role for him with Brooklyn the last couple of years as a kind of a big in some ways, despite the fact that he's 6'5", but a good perimeter defender, good finisher around the rim, great floater game. Shot well from 3 last year, actually. It's kind of surprisingly pretty small volume, but a shooting development for him is good to see. Kind of a weird fit on a team that has a traditional center like the Hawks do with Capella and even with Okongwu as a non-shooter right now. But I think that Brown would be a guy who'd be very, very helpful in a lot of ways as a defender and someone who can attack the rim for the Hawks. Victor Oladipo, a guy that the Hawks fans got to see up close and personal against Miami. Kind of a weird market for him, I think, at this point, as a 30-year-old former All-Star. Some flashes, but offensively, it's been kind of a struggle efficiency-wise for the last few years. But defensively, he was pretty good in the playoffs. And obviously, I kind of thought that he would come to Atlanta, unless it was kind of sort of the high-dollar offer for him. But he has some usage potential offensively. Got to be on the list of guys you always check in on. Otto Porter Jr. is a really good natural fit in my mind. I was put with the Warriors this last year on that title-winning team. Only 29, which is crazy. Seems like he's like 35, but he's only 29, but has been hurt a lot. Former top 3 pick in the draft. Missed like 3 years almost, not in full, but majority of 3 straight years before this. Last year, he was actually really good in a smaller role for the Warriors. Pretty sort of a 3-and-D kind of forward type. A little bit slower than he used to be defensively, but a little bit stronger potentially. Guard some 4s, maybe even fake it against some 5s. Always been a good shooter, good ball mover on offense. Just a really, really useful role player. A little bit limited athletically, but like in the Gallo plus role would be interesting for the Hawks for sure. Obviously, also be kind of a leader, tutor type for Jalen Johnson. Guy that I would definitely be calling. Pat Connaughton is someone I think will go back to Milwaukee, to be honest, but he opted out, so he's a free agent. I think he's like a starting caliber wing. I think he's underrated. 39% from 3 the last 2 years. Good defender, pretty good athlete. Full mid-level guy for me in a lot of ways. I think he'll be going back to Milwaukee, but I always wanted to mention his name at this point in time as sort of that in the full MLE kind of section. Now, from there, and by the way, I purposely left off like all of these like pure centers and all of the pure point guards for the most part. At least at this point, I can't imagine the Hawks using a ton of resources on either one of those things, barring other trades. So I kind of wanted to move on from there. But keep that in mind. If the Hawks were to move on from Capella or Kongwu or had nothing behind Trae, they have to get something at center. That's also worth just kind of acknowledging. But I want to pivot now to some guys who are not going to sign for the minimum probably, but also are not worth like more than $5 million a year for instance. I think Wes Matthews, who will be 36 in October, would be very useful. I think he just likes to play in Milwaukee. Like, there was no reason why he needed to wait around for Milwaukee last year and play for a very cheap contract. He was actually quite good in the playoffs for the Bucks, but I think he'll probably be going back there or retiring, one of the two. Nemanja Bjelica, a Warriors champion, but a 34-year-old big man. I know my friend Glenn Willis has talked about Bjelica as a potential Gallo replacement. If they want to have something that's like kind of close to being Gallo without being Gallo and being a lot cheaper, I think Bjelica would be a pretty useful guy in that route. A better defender than Gallo also. Not a great defender, but definitely better than Gallo. A little bit quicker on his feet, a little bit more stout defensively. Good shooter, good passer as a veteran big man. Daniel House has had a super weird career. Best known probably for getting kicked out of the bubble back when he was with Houston. But a potential 3-and-D guy is actually pretty good with Utah last year, and everybody needs those 3-and-D kind of wing types. Derrick Jones Jr. has always been an interesting Hawks target. Not a shooter, which kind of limits him a little bit with the Hawks compared to when he's playing with guys like Capella or Kongwu, but a really good defender, lanky, great athlete, of course, above the rim, but kind of an interesting flyer type. Jeremy Lamb as a more like shooting guard-ish kind of wing if they were to move on from Herter or Bogdanovich, a Norcross High School product, worth noting, a pretty good offensive player and has been a rotation guy in the league for like 7 or 8 years now. Howell Neto is more of a backup point guard type, but can play a little bit in that role for pretty cheap if they were to not bring back Delon Wright and didn't want to just hand the reins over to Sharif Cooper just yet in that role. And then maybe a flyer on Jarrett Culver as like a buy low guy, former lottery pick, obviously, in the DeAndre Hunter draft. Has not been good, full stop. I was wrong about him in the draft, but I think that there's still some talent there to sort of buy low on potentially if you want to get him for a cheap deal that was team friendly. Then you have like kind of your Delon Wright only tier because he kind of has to be treated differently because of the bird rights that he has. I am obviously, if you're a new listener, you might not notice, I love Delon Wright. I'm in the tank for Delon Wright. The Hawks can pay him whatever they want to bring him back. I don't think he's going to have like $10 million a year offers this time around, but I think he'll actually get more than the minimum from somebody, whether it's the Hawks or not. He is unrestricted. That's worth noting. I've seen some people just assuming he'll be back. I would not go that far. I think the Hawks should try to sign Delon Wright, but he can leave if he wants to. There's no reason he cannot leave Atlanta. He absolutely can unilaterally leave. So you cannot just like write him in and pen on the roster. And I think that for me, though, anything reasonable from a price standpoint for Delon Wright, you just pay it and keep him. He can be useful as a backup point guard. He can be useful as a backup wing. He can play defense. He can pass. He can do all the little things to help you win basketball games. He shot the ball decently well in a small sample size this year. I just love Delon. He's a winning player. Great locker room guy by all accounts as well. So I think that's a guy that everybody seems to love, and I am on that camp as well. And if you can get him back for anything reasonable, I would go ahead and do that. From there, before we get out of here, some minimum guys. I think they're probably maybe a little bit more than that, but probably just minimum because of what the Hawks are at this point in time. Juan Toscano Anderson from the Warriors. Not sure if you can trust his shooting, but a guy who plays hard, plays defense, and has decent size. It's like a 6'6" wing. Josh Okogie is a former local guy. Actually grew up in Gwinnett County, played at Shiloh High School, Georgia Tech product as well. He's played in like 250 games in the NBA almost, and he's still 23 years old. The problem is he can't shoot. And I understand that, but Okogie is a good defender and a guy you might want to just take a flyer on as a local guy. And I think if you could slide him in between like Trey and Herter or Trey and Bogey on offense, you can kind of hide the shooting a little bit. I would definitely keep an eye on him, especially at the minimum. That would be a good signing in my mind as the Hawks. PJ Dozier was hurt last year, but was a rotation guy for the Nuggets a couple years ago. 25 years old, good athlete, can guard a little bit. A bunch of former Hawks that I'll at least mention because they are noteworthy names, also because they might sign for the minimum and be kind of useful. These are in no order, but Kent Bazemore was not good with the Lakers last year. He might be kind of cooked at this point. That's definitely in play, but a guy who might be an interesting add as a potential two-way, backup wing kind of type. DeAndre Bembry got hurt in March. Actually, had a pretty serious knee injury, so he might be out for too long to consider signing him. But he was good last year, actually, kind of sneakily, kind of fixed his jump shot a little bit, and has always been a good defender. So someone to keep an eye on if he's able to play early in the season, potentially maybe by December-ish. I'm not sure how the timeline is there. Tony Snell has not missed a free throw in more than 3 seasons. I love Tony Snell. Nothing exciting at all about Tony Snell. Tony Snell is like totally just fine, like 12th man type. But Tony Snell in the TLC role from last year would look just fine. He's obviously a great shooter in a lot of ways, could guard a little bit. Would be totally fine with him plugging that hole as a veteran on the roster. Paul Millsap is 37 now. He's kind of just a center at this point, but obviously on a vet minimum contract to kind of teach Kongwu, give them some leadership stuff, play in a pinch would not be a bad idea. And obviously he's a fantastic locker room guy dating back to Atlanta. So all of those guys, also Damian Lee was a very brief Hawk, but could be a minimum kind of two-way wing type, could shoot a little bit, etc. Always been kind of a smart player as well. Elsewhere, non-Hawks division for now. We'll come back to a couple more guys later on. Javon Carter is kind of a weird point guard size guy, but a great defender and a career 39% 2-point shooter, which is really, really tough. But he can shoot and he can guard. That's the problem with Carter, obviously, is why he's not sort of in high demand, because he can't really get to the rim as a small guard. But a potentially useful role player. Eric Bledsoe, if he is bought out or cut, could be sort of an interesting two-way backup guard type. James Johnson is more of a defensive kind of enforcer player at this point, but a veteran, 35-year-old, kind of brings some toughness. Might be a minimum kind of addition. Austin Rivers, actually, I've always thought was underrated and has not been making a lot of money recently, but like a pretty useful like fourth guard type with some shooting, some ball handling, some defense. Rodney Magruder, totally solid plug and play, like fifth wing type. Semi Ojale, I have a soft spot for his defense and his physicality, but he just can't shoot, which is the problem there. Frank Ntilikina is on a non-guarantee, but if Dallas were to move on from him, I would love that as a potential flyer fit. I've always liked his game. My guy Solomon Hill, of course, a former Hawk, is a free agent. I'm not sure if he's healthy just yet because, of course, he missed the rest of the season with New York. But I've been saying for a while that Solo or someone like Solo makes a lot of sense because he's just the leadership aspect, the voice in the locker room aspect. And also, they could have used Solomon Hill on the court last year as a sort of that big, bruising combo forward defender. Obviously, he's a little bit limited athletically and not a great shooter at this point, but certainly like a 14th man type that would be very, very good to have around. And then finally, the guys from this year's team, Kevin Knox, maybe if they were to sign him for cheap, I wouldn't mind it. You cannot offer him the qualifying offer in my mind. That's way too much money for Kevin Knox. But if he's available for like the minimum, I wouldn't mind that. Gorgie Jang, especially if they were to move on from one of the centers, but even if they don't, you probably want to have another center on the roster. Nate likes to have a third center around, and Gorgie for the minimum would be fine. I know he's not this like the sexiest guy in the world, but Gorgie Jang is a totally fine minimum center, third center type, totally fine. And then TLC, similarly to Gorgie, not a guy you want to have to play. He definitely played more than they thought he was going to have to play last year. Remember, he was on a non-guaranteed minimum a year ago. But similarly to like guys like, I don't know, Damian Lee or Rodney Magruder, he's on that same kind of level. Even Tony Snell, potentially. I think Snell's probably a little bit better than TLC, but a perfectly adequate 14th man kind of depth wing that you hope doesn't have to play but might be able to play at this point in time. So I know that's a lot of names, but at this point, it's going to be really interesting to see what the Hawks actually do. The first dominoes could be trade related when it comes to Dejounte Murray or John Collins or stuff that we've not heard about at this point in time at all. But as of Thursday, all these guys are in play for free agency. The Hawks have to fill out the roster. As my final point here on the podcast, last year in particular, the Hawks did not have a ton of roster spots available. And yes, there are guys on the periphery of the Hawks roster right now that are not counting toward the cap at this moment that could be back, like your Sharif Cooper, obviously. Is a guy that the Hawks, I'm sure, will keep around on some level, but might be on a two-way, might be on the minimum, etc. Skylar Mays is kind of all sort of lurking around the roster. Shawnee Brown on a two-way contract. They have Tyrese Martin, the second round pick that could be on a full deal or a two-way deal. So they have some bodies, but at minimum, the Hawks are going to have to sign some guys to fill out this roster, no matter what they do with Murray or something else. So they have some spots to work with, and that's kind of why I'm listing out so many different guys on this podcast. But there you go. That's my wide-ranging free agency preview. And if we have news on Dejounte Murray, I promise I will break in and record a podcast as quickly as possible because it's very interesting. One final reminder, Wednesday is a big day for Gallinari. That's his guarantee date. So if you're looking for stuff to keep an eye on Wednesday and even beyond the free agency stuff, Gallo's final resolution will be quite intriguing, and we'll have full coverage of that on Wednesday into Thursday. And then the madness begins on Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern time. Okay, that's it for me on this podcast. Please subscribe to the show on Apple or Spotify or Stitcher or even YouTube on the video side. Please follow me on Twitter at BT Rowland. Follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Hawks. And we'll see you all next time.